This Napoleon Ottoman Emperor reacted to all three parts of this. It's from Geohistory. So this was it. It's from 1768 to 1804.
The story begins in 1768 in Corsica. For centuries, the island was a Genoese possession, but separatist revolts forced Genoa to ask help from the French army. In the end, the sovereignty of the island is ceded to France.
Treaty of
The following
Versailles.
year, Napoleon Bonaparte is born into a noble family from Ajaccio. He grows up with his 7 brothers and sisters, and when he turns 9, is sent to the military school in Brienne-Champagne. Napoleon, a good student, is admitted to the military academy in Paris, where he specializes in artillery. The following year, at age 16, he is appointed second lieutenant of the artillery in Valence.
And that was great. Yes, revolution.
In France, the economic situation is catastrophic. The 7 Years' War and the American Revolutionary War have emptied the coffers of the country. Louis XVI, struggling with the country's financial difficulties, summons to Versailles representatives of the clergy, the nobility, and the Third Estate, that is the people, to find a solution to the crisis. After disagreements,
And the
Third
caste
Estate
system.
officials seize power by founding the National Assembly. While in Paris, insurgents take over the royal fortress of Bastille. The revolutionaries vote for ending feudal privileges and adopt the Declaration of the Rights of the Man and the Citizen. King Louis XVI is then forcibly taken to Paris, from where he later tries to flee with his family to a royalist stronghold. But they are spotted and stopped on the way.
European reactions.
Initially, European monarchies remained mute about the French Revolution, seeing the weakening of their French competitor as a good thing. But the arrest of Louis XVI make them fear that revolutionary ideas might spread across the continent and threaten their thrones. Prussia and Austria then combine forces to try and restore the French monarchy. War breaks out, with the French armies in poor condition. Facing the Allied army advance on Paris, the revolutionaries panic and execute all opponents of the revolution. But eventually, an unexpected victory of the French army pushes the coalition back beyond the country's borders. The revolutionaries regain confidence and proclaim the Republic. Louis XVI is then tried and guillotined, further angering European monarchies. The coalition strengthens, while on the French side, conscriptions swell up the ranks of the army.
Yes, when guillotine was invented, siege of
Within the
Toulon.
country, clashes between royalist and counter-revolutionary forces cause civil wars. Napoleon and his family, who support the revolution, are driven away by Corsican separatists. In Toulon, royalists seize the city and receive the military support of Britain and Spain, that enter the harbour of Toulon with their armies. After the French army fails to retake the city, Napoleon is summoned to replace the artillery commander who was injured. Assessing the situation, he suggests a new plan. Instead of attacking from the north, he proposes seizing the forts south of the harbour to install his artillery and attack the Allied fleet. His plan proves successful, and the city is taken back in 2 days. Napoleon's
Strategic
decisive intervention earns him a promotion. But in Paris, a new coup overthrows the government and Napoleon loses his title. A year later, a royalist revolt breaks out in Paris and he is put in charge of quelling the rebellion, giving him an opportunity to prove his loyalty for the new government. He orders his men to fire on the crowd, killing 200 people and ending the insurgency. As a reward, Napoleon is given command of the French army of Italy.
Italian campaign.
Before leaving Paris, Napoleon marries Josephine, with whom he had fallen madly in love. She is the widow of a guillotined viscount and a mother of 2. Napoleon joins his army, which he finds in poor state.
Nice.
His men are poorly fed, badly equipped, and no longer paid. Napoleon would assume the role of their charismatic leader and motivates his troops by promising them the riches of northern Italy. At this time, 2 armies are stationed there, a Piedmontese army and an Austrian one. Napoleon is outnumbered and knows that if both armies unite, he would have no chance. His plan is to speedily advance his troops, place them in between both armies, and fight them separately. On April 10, he launches his attack. The plan works,
And
and
that's
after a
going
few
in.
battles, he defeats the Kingdom of Sardinia.
He wants to do 1v1 against Austria.
Reeling from the attack, the Austrian army retreats to Milan and stations some troops along the Po River to prevent Napoleon from crossing. Napoleon sends over a small part of his army as a diversion while the bulk of his troops cross the river further east. This move threatens to break the Austrian line of communication, thus isolating its army, which then withdraws from Milan without fighting and flees eastward. For a year, Napoleon maintains an advantage thanks to his troops' speedy movement and because Austrian forces divide itself into smaller armies. Eventually, Napoleon's army threatened
Speeding up the
Vienna,
process.
forcing to seek an armistice. Napoleon negotiates and himself signs the peace treaty. He obtains the annexation of the Austrian Netherlands and pushes the boundaries of the country to the Rhine. Austria receives the Republic of Venice and recognizes the new Italian republics created by Napoleon.
Nice.
Upon his return to Paris, Napoleon is welcomed as a hero. The government now asks him to invade Britain, the last enemy of France. But England has control over the seas, and Napoleon is aware of the risk that this entails. He instead suggests attacking Britain, where it
Even
is
in
expected.
yeah.
By seizing Egypt, he thinks he can threaten the important colony of India. The government accepts the proposal. As for them, this young general, who is a bit too ambitious and influential, is less dangerous while he is on mission. Napoleon leaves from Toulon with hundreds of ships carrying a 40,000-man army. Along the way, he captures Malta, while British Admiral Nelson, not knowing Napoleon's final destination, tries looking for him. Nelson reaches Alexandria before Napoleon and continues searching for him northward.
Okay. Britain's way
Napoleon
on.
lands near Alexandria in the Ottoman province of Egypt. He captures the city and then goes on further south. At the gates of Cairo, he defeats the Mamluk army and seizes the city. But in the north, British ships eventually find the French fleet and completely destroy it. Napoleon and his army find themselves stuck in Egypt. This information spreads in Europe and leads to the creation of a second anti-French coalition joined by the Ottoman Empire. Napoleon then goes back to the east, seizing towns along the way, and begins the siege of Akko. But the Ottoman resistance, supported by the British, prevents the city from being captured. Napoleon then hears that the British are preparing for the landing of an Ottoman army in Alexandria.
They're
He
coming
leaves
there.
to fight them and wins the battle with the last soldiers he had available. Hearing about the complicated situation in France, he travels alone, leaving behind his army.
It's a long journey. Go on 18 Roma.
When he reaches France, the situation is tense. Austrian and Russian armies retake northern Italy, while Paris suffers from political instability. Napoleon, supported by the people and the army, involves himself in a coup and is named as a first consul for the following 10 years. He is now head of the country and can reform it at will. He consolidates power and prepares a new army to reconquer the north of Italy. To Austria's surprise, he crosses the Great St. Bernard Pass, usually deemed impassable, and wins a battle against the Austrians. A second victory further north eventually defeats the empire.
Again.
Within months, a peace treaty is signed by all European powers, including the UK, their arch-enemy. In France, Napoleon put an end to 10 years of revolutions and instability and is rewarded with the title of lifelong consul.
Report.
Napoleon takes advantage of peacetime to reform the country. He reforms the administration, economy, and education. He begins writing the civil code and completely restructures the country's army. Beyond France, he continues with his expansionist and interventionist policy by redrawing boundaries at will, which angers other powers, especially the United Kingdom, for whom France is too big a risk. Aware of the situation, Napoleon sells Louisiana to the United States to finance future wars and to prevent the territory from falling into the hands of the British. War resumes, but the UK cannot afford to attack France on its territory and instead decides to focus on diplomatic efforts to rally other powers.
Emperor.
Napoleon, who narrowly escaped an attack, knows his life is in danger. He tries to sustain the new French model by creating an empire, hoping that revolutionary values remain strong even if he were to die. On December 2nd, 1804, Napoleon becomes the emperor and crowns himself and his wife Josephine in Notre-Dame de Paris. He implements a more authoritarian regime. From a military standpoint, he makes Spain go to war against the United Kingdom because he needs its military fleet. Having now brought together enough armies along the Channel, Napoleon is ready to invade the United Kingdom.
Will he though? It is part of Conquest of Europe.
France and its Spanish ally are at war against the United Kingdom. Napoleon's Great Army, or the so-called Grande Armée, is gathered along the Channel coast, ready to invade the island. To this end, Napoleon asks the French Mediterranean fleet to head for the Caribbean to lure the powerful Royal Navy. They must then rush back to the English Channel to facilitate a military landing. But upon their return, the plan fails. The French fleet is spotted and attacked along the Spanish coast, forcing its retreat to Cadiz. But Napoleon, the recently named French emperor and the King of Italy, has already changed his plan since the United Kingdom convinced Russia and Austria to form a new anti-French coalition. The British would finance the war.
Combined together.
Austria sends an army to Italy and a second to Bavaria, where the Russian army would join. Napoleon then sends his great army at full speed to Bavaria in order to arrive before the Russians. He organizes a diversion by sending an army corps into the Black Forest, where the Austrians wait, ready to fight, while the main battalion of the army gets around them in the north. The Austrian army discovers, too late, that they are surrounded. 5 days later, 25,000 soldiers surrender without a fight. Meanwhile, Napoleon orders his fleet, still blocked in Cadiz, to join the Mediterranean. The French and Spanish fleets try to end the British blockade, but are destroyed by the fleet of Admiral Nelson, who dies during the battle. With this victory, the United Kingdom reaffirms its maritime supremacy.
In Spain, domination.
In Austria, the Russian army retreats towards the northeast to await reinforcements, paving the way for the French to Vienna. Meanwhile, in the south, a second Austrian army is defeated and retreats. Napoleon seizes the Austrian capital. He decides to leave a big part of his army there and leaves with 60,000 soldiers to meet the army of Alexander I of Russia, which has received reinforcements from Francis II. As he is outnumbered, Napoleon decides to station his troops on the strategic plateau of Pratzen. He studies the field and devises a plan. On the evening of December 1st, as the Austro-Russian army approaches, he orders his troops to retreat, pretending to flee. The army of the Allies jumps on the opportunity and seizes the plateau for the night.
Yes, Austerlitz.
The next morning, convinced that the French are retreating, 40,000 Russians charge towards the south. The outnumbered French army tries to hold them back best as they can. But further north, hidden behind the hills, the bulk of the French army launches a surprise attack and takes back the plateau. The Austro-Russian army finds itself split in two. The Russians try at all costs to take back the plateau, but fail. The army in the north is pushed back to the east, while the French surround thousands of Russian soldiers in the south. Russian troops panic and surrender, or try to escape on frozen ponds, which are targeted by French artillery fire. With the French victory complete, the Emperor of Austria negotiates peace. He loses control over the German states, marking the end of the Holy Roman Empire, which would gradually be replaced by the Confederation of the Rhine under Napoleon's protection. Napoleon appoints his brother Joseph as the King of Naples and his other brother Louis as the King of Holland. He also begins the construction of the Arc de Triomphe in Paris to celebrate future victories.
What coalition?
Prussia dislikes French management of the German states, so comes together with other powers to form a fourth coalition against France. 3 Prussian armies enter Saxony and an ultimatum is given to the French, demanding their withdrawal to the west of the Rhine. Napoleon goes to meet them with his great army. Initial contact is established. The French immediately get the upper hand, causing the Prussian armies to turn back to Leipzig. But the French army, which is faster, catches up and positions itself between the two main
surrounded.
armies. Napoleon then makes an error of judgment. Thinking that the great Prussian army is in the south, he sends a small army of 25,000 men to the north. They find themselves confronted by the great Prussian army of over 60,000 men.
Yes.
However, despite the odds, both battles are won by the French that day, opening the doors of Berlin to Napoleon.
25,000 versus 60,000. Well, let's compare.
With Prussia defeated, Napoleon attacks Russia. Along the way, he enters Polish territory, which was captured and shared between Russia, Prussia, and Austria 10 years earlier. The French are welcomed as heroes, and thousands of people join the ranks of the army. The Russians avoid battle and retreat to await reinforcements. Eventually, the two armies start fighting. 2 days of fierce battles ensue, causing thousands of fatalities. Both sides are tested and need time to recruit new forces. 4 months later, the Russians try to surprise the French by launching a frontal attack. But they are repelled and chased. A second decisive battle drives the Russian army beyond the Niemen River. Exhausted by war, neither side is able to gain supremacy over the other. A peace treaty is prepared.
It is ill set.
Both sides meet on a raft especially built for the occasion on the Niemen River, where Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I negotiate. According to the terms of the treaty, Prussia loses half of its territory. Its western territories are annexed to the Kingdom of Westphalia, of which Jerome Bonaparte becomes the king. In the east, the Duchy of Warsaw is created. Allied with France, this new state could act as a strategic buffer in case of future war. Russia, on the other hand, gets the authorization to seize Finland. Finally, the two powers ally against the United Kingdom, which finds itself squeezed by French domination on the continent. Weakened by wars, the UK faces a difficult economic situation. And now, Napoleon tries to deliver a final blow by imposing a continental blockade. No European port may accept British commercial vessels. But not everyone agrees with this policy, including Portugal, a historical ally of the British.
Peninsula War.
In response, Napoleon wants to invade Portugal. Its Spanish ally joins the offensive and allows French troops to cross its territory. The following month, the Franco-Spanish army seizes Lisbon, forcing the royal family to flee to Brazil. But after this victory, new French troops are sent to Spain. Napoleon begins to show a new interest in Spain, which is no longer the great power it once was. After a coup attempt orchestrated by Ferdinand against his father, King Charles IV, both go to Bayonne to ask Napoleon to resolve the situation. Meanwhile in Madrid, people rise against the French occupiers. The revolt is violently put down. Napoleon then decides to place his brother Joseph on the throne of the country, while his brother-in-law Murat gets the kingdom of Naples.
And Guerrilla is coming back.
The French brutality in Madrid infuriates the Spanish
Many in
population.
Spain.
Throughout the country, militias form and organize a guerrilla warfare against the French,
Yeah.
targeting isolated garrisons and lines of communication. The French are tortured and slaughtered. In response, French armies burn to the ground villages suspected of harboring rebels. In the years to come, France would need to constantly strengthen its military presence to try and defeat rebel strongholds. In the south, a French army is defeated. In panic, Joseph Bonaparte flees Madrid with his army. The news spreads throughout Europe, reinforcing anti-French sentiments. Meanwhile, a British army contingent lands in Portugal.
British is arriving.
Napoleon wants to settle things himself with his great army, but fearful of being outflanked in the east, he organizes a meeting with the Tsar to try and strengthen their alliance, but in vain. He still sends part of his army to the peninsula, where the Spanish armies, divided and poorly organized, are crushed in a month. While advancing on the British army, Napoleon learns that Austria is ready to go to war. Leaving his army in Spain, he quickly heads eastwards, where the Austrian army enters Bavaria. They hope to be joined by Prussia and the Confederation of the Rhine, driven by rising German nationalism. But it would not happen. Meanwhile, Napoleon asks Russia to go to war against Austria, which it declines.
Coalition.
A fifth coalition is formed, but in fact, Austria finds itself alone against Napoleon. Within days, the Austrian army is divided into two. The main body manages to flee north of the Danube, leaving Vienna defenseless. Napoleon seizes the Austrian capital for the second time, while the Austrian army positions itself north of the Danube. To complete victory, Napoleon must find a way to cross the river, but all bridges are destroyed. He begins building bridges and attempts to cross with his army. But a powerful Austrian offensive pushes them back to the island of Lobau. This is Napoleon's first major defeat. He moves back to Vienna to strengthen his army and organize a new offensive. In one night, he makes more than 140,000 soldiers cross the Danube. Over 2 days of fierce and bloody fighting, the Austrians retreat and ask for an armistice.
Program. 13. Sconbro.
As per this unfavorable peace treaty, Austria loses many of its territories and its access to the sea. Moreover, Napoleon divorces Josephine, with whom he cannot get legitimate heirs, and marries Marie-Louise, daughter of the Emperor of Austria, with whom he hopes to have a child. In France, Napoleon becomes increasingly authoritarian, jailing political opponents, censoring the media, and spreading his propaganda. The economic situation of the country worsens. Wars, and especially the 300,000 soldiers stationed in Spain, are expensive and require a lot of resources. On March the 20th, 1811, Marie-Louise gives birth to Napoleon's much-awaited heir. The baby receives the title of the King of Rome. In Portugal, a new British army, led by Wellington, takes over and pushes the French army away. The French army requests reinforcements from Napoleon, but these remain unanswered as he focuses all his strength on the Duchy of Warsaw. The relationship with Russia deteriorates, causing Napoleon to prepare for the invasion of the country.
Russian invasion. It is a party decline. 1812 to 1821.
Napoleon controls almost the entire European continent. Having defeated Prussia and Austria, he tries hard to dominate Spain. In the West, the United Kingdom has always been his biggest opponent. The island is well defended by its powerful Royal Navy. The country sends an army to Portugal, which, with the help of local forces, chases away the French. They now threaten to take over Spain. To the east, Russia and France see a gradual weakening in their relationship, although they are officially allied. Russia has never backed Napoleon in his wars and now refuses to implement the continental blockade imposed by Napoleon on the UK. Having had enough, Napoleon plans to invade Russia. He gathers more than 650,000 soldiers from all over Europe and signs alliances with Prussia and Austria. Meanwhile, Russia signs a peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire and prepares its troops at the border.
French invasion of Russia.
Napoleon hopes for a blitz and an easy victory that would force the Tsar to negotiate peace. His army crosses the Niemen River towards the Russian armies. Its south wing is constituted of an Austrian contingent and its north wing by Prussia. But the Russian armies, largely outnumbered, avoid engaging in battle and retreat deep into the land. Napoleon then accelerates the pace and tries to catch up. His supply lines are stretched quickly, requiring excellent organization by many men. The Russians deploy the scorched earth tactic, burning down everything in their path while retreating. Many soldiers die of exhaustion along the way. Finally reaching the gates of Moscow, Napoleon and his 130,000 remaining soldiers go face to face with 120,000 Russians. The
Borodino.
battle proves to be a bloody affair, which France wins with great difficulty.
Retreat from Russia.
Napoleon and his 100,000 men enter Moscow, which was evacuated. A week later, Russian soldiers set fire to the city. During 5 weeks, Napoleon tries to negotiate peace with the Tsar, but receives no response. Eventually, as winter is coming, Napoleon is forced to retreat. Along the way, the troops at the back of his formation are subject to constant attack. Further west, 2 Russian armies prepare to block his retreat. Napoleon understands that he must hurry if he does not want his army to be annihilated. His troops, exhausted and starving, now suffer from the frost and snow. Horses die of exhaustion and are eaten, while the artillery is abandoned. When they reach the Berezina River, a Russian army is stationed in front of the bridge to block them. Napoleon discreetly sends men further north to build 2 bridges. Eventually, while the French troops cross the river, the Russian battalion approaching from the north reaches them. Bridges are burned to prevent the Russians from following them, condemning the fate of the remaining 10,000 French soldiers who could not cross on time. Only a few tens of thousands of French soldiers managed to leave Russia, while Napoleon leaves alone for Paris. Upon reaching Paris, Napoleon moves quickly to raise a new army. Meanwhile, the Tsar, despite being weakened by war, continues the offensive, knowing he has much to gain if he becomes the liberator of Europe. The Tsar moves diplomatically closer to Prussia, which considers the possibility of freeing the Confederation of the Rhine from Napoleon. This would render Prussia as the new influential power in the region. The King of Prussia discreetly prepares his armies. Austria chooses to be neutral for the moment, while the Confederation of the Rhine remains loyal to Napoleon. Once the Russian army is at the gates of Berlin, Prussia declares war on France. Together, they leave for Saxony to fight what is left of Napoleon's great army. But the latter is joined by Napoleon's new army, and with a few victories, they force Prussia and Russia to seek a truce. Meanwhile, in the Iberian Peninsula, Wellington's army, along with the Portuguese and Spanish forces, seizes Madrid and is preparing to expel the French from the country. During the truce, while the armies are reinforced on both sides, the battle plays out on the diplomatic level. Sweden joins the coalition, while Austria offers mediation to Napoleon. Austria suggests to restore the so-called natural frontiers of France in exchange for peace. But Napoleon does not take up the offer, and Austria joins the coalition. The truce is broken, causing the 3 great armies to march on to the Confederation of the Rhine. Their advance forces Napoleon to play the defensive card. He retreats to Leipzig, where a decisive battle involving 500,000 men takes place. During 3 days, the French and their allies resist the offensive, but besieged on 3 fronts, they finally must retreat. During battle, the only functioning bridge is destroyed too early, condemning a third of the French army. Napoleon crosses the Rhine with only 70,000 men, while the Confederation of the Rhine joins the coalition. Meanwhile, in Spain, the French army, chased by Wellington, is pushed back to the borders. France is besieged from all sides. The French armies, completely outnumbered, resist as well as they can the advance towards the country. But the coalition eventually enters Paris. Napoleon, who is in Fontainebleau, is forced to abdicate.
Congress of Vienna.
Napoleon loses all powers. He is then forced by the coalition to go into exile with a few hundred men on the island of Elba, over which he has sovereignty. In France, the monarchy is restored and King Louis XVIII accedes to the throne. In Vienna, the victors meet for several months in order to redraw the new borders of the continent and try to establish a long-term peace plan for Europe. Representatives from small states are not given a voice in the negotiation. Big powers lead the discussions and carve up territories. The Duchy of Warsaw mainly becomes Congress Poland in a personal union with the Tsar of Russia. Prussia extends westwards, while the Confederation of the Rhine becomes the German Confederation. Austria recovers many lost territories, while old kingdoms are recreated in Italy. The United Kingdom of the Netherlands and Sweden-Norway are created. Finally, Switzerland's neutrality is recognized by all. From his island, Napoleon follows closely developments on the continent, especially in France. He knows that the return of the monarchy is little appreciated by the people. For one last time, he would decide to try and regain power. He secretly leaves for France. Napoleon lands near Cannes with a few hundred men. On his way to Paris, he receives a hero's welcome in cities, while French troops also join him. When he reaches the capital, the king has already fled and Napoleon gets back power. But in Vienna, heads of state form a seventh coalition. Napoleon prepares the country for war. In the Netherlands, an army under the Duke of Wellington's command is prepared, while in Prussia, Blücher's army goes to join him. In the east, an Austrian army is waiting to be joined by the Russian army, which would arrive several months later. Napoleon decides to make the first move. If he can prevent the armies of Wellington and Blücher from joining forces, he may then also be successful in preventing the Austrian and Russian armies from doing the same. He leaves immediately with 125,000 men. Upon arrival, the Prussian army finds itself stretched and disorganized, while the army of the Duke of Wellington, consisting of soldiers from Britain, the Netherlands and German states, is positioned near Brussels. Napoleon just about manages to prevent both armies from joining forces and pushes them both further north. An army of 30,000 men chases the Prussian troops, while Napoleon advances towards Wellington, who has positioned himself on a ridge near Waterloo. The next day, the French army, which is reaching Wavre, sees most of the Prussian army leaving westwards and decides not to chase them, instead preferring to attack the garrisons left behind in the city. On the Western Front, Napoleon and Wellington engage in fierce battle. In the afternoon, as Napoleon seems to be winning, the first Prussians arrive from the east. Napoleon has no choice but to send some of his men on the Eastern Front, which leads to his defeat. Napoleon goes back to Paris and tries for the last time to form an army, but the government refuses. He then leaves incognito to Rochefort, where he hopes to board a ship for the United States. But British soldiers are checking the port. After wandering for several days, Napoleon, aware he's a wanted man, tries his luck and asks the British to take him to the United States. But instead, they take him to the island of St. Helena, which would become Napoleon's last prison. Isolated and closely surveyed in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, he would no longer be able to influence anyone anymore. He writes his memoirs, eventually falls sick, dies on May 5, 1821, and is buried in the island. In 1840, his remains are unearthed and brought back to the Invalides in Paris. To this day, it serves as Napoleon's tomb.
He never gives up in war. He's always trying to find a solution. Yes, you can win every day. Troops sent out an Austrian action to in exchange for all the wealth. Mississippi testing video, the video development in hospital.